There are certain ways that couples interact with each other that can pretty accurately predict divorce sometime in their near future. One marriage and divorce researcher called these the four horsemen of the apocalypse, and with good reason. This term conjures up some really scary things that are supposed to immediately follow the four horsemen. So in the case of communication between couples, it just means that if you don't change your communication up just a little bit, things could start getting worse for the relationship in the near future. The four horsemen of the apocalypse describe some really negative communication patterns. These are criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. Criticism is when you have something negative to say about somebody else or something that they do or other people in their lives, something important to them, and you're not afraid to say it or pile it on thick. We're all familiar with what criticism is and what it looks like when somebody's being critical. Now, this is very much different than constructive criticism or productive feedback. Constructive criticism usually has a positive end in mind. It's supposed to be productive. It's supposed to build the other person up and help them get better versus tearing them down. The goal is to have a productive outcome and everybody leaves the conversation, feeling pretty warm and fuzzy, or at the very least not feeling really bad about themselves. One way of doing it is giving somebody a shy sandwich where the bread equals good things you say about them and the meat equals something hard and heavy that you have to say about them. The actual criticism that hopefully is constructive. Non-constructive criticism might look like just venting something just to satisfy some emotion you have, just to get something off your shoulders without regard for positive outcomes, productive outcomes, or how the other person might feel. What you want to do instead is still drive toward your productive outcome and at the same time try to keep in mind the feelings of the other person involved, whether or not they'll hear your message depending on how you deliver it, what's more likely to drive them toward that positive, productive outcome, which is usually that they don't feel like you're just slamming them. Now for contempt. Contempt is a really damaging communication style. Nobody likes to feel like somebody else has contempt for them, and feeling contempt for other people isn't really a comfortable emotion either. Contempt is like disgust on steroids. You might be disgusted with somebody else, with something that they do, something about their character. You might be really disgusted with something that somebody tends to do, but even worse, you might be disgusted with them as a person. It can be hard to keep it separate once it's reached this level of feeling, this level of intensity. And it can be really hard for the person receiving the contempt to feel like it is just about their actions and not about them as a person. At this point, it might be kind of a wash. Something that might be useful in trying to not convey contempt to somebody important to you is trying to separate their actions from them as a person. Are you really bothered by something that they do or something about them as a person, something about their character or their personality? Something that's really important to consider when you're feeling this level of emotion is to ask yourself, what's really going on? What's happening in here that got triggered that I feel this level of intense emotion? You might find that it's not even about the other person, it might be about you somehow. What in you is getting triggered by the other person acting a certain way or being a certain way? Is it something you really don't like about yourself and that's why you feel so strongly toward them? If so, there's definitely some work to do on that end, which doesn't look like just getting the other person to do something differently or to be something differently. Not a lot of fun work to do there, but definitely important work. Now, the other two horsemen from more of a defense position. The first one is defensiveness. This is obviously what it sounds like. When somebody's coming at us, when we're feeling attacked, we naturally get defensive. That's a very natural human position to take. It's just that some other negative things can come from that position. When we're feeling defensive, we're a lot less willing to look at our stuff because most people aren't going to open up themselves and be vulnerable when somebody's already attacking them. It's a lot harder to make a conversation go well if we're less willing to look at our own stuff and we've got some pretty heavy walls up because we have to. So we're not as willing to bring a lot of our good stuff to the table. What we are going to come up with is either more defensiveness or we're going to start attacking back. And then obviously, attacking invites more defensiveness, and we just get further down that road that we don't want to go down. A good way of breaking out of defensiveness, just like with contempt, is try to separate somebody's actions from their character or somebody's behaviors from who they are as a person. It's a lot easier to not get defensive if we feel like somebody is giving us constructive feedback on something we do versus on who we are as a person. If somebody's attacking our behaviors, it's a lot easier to stay with it and stay engaged and not defend than if we feel like they're attacking us as a person. It's not as threatening if they're saying, hey, you need to do something differently than if they're saying, hey, you need to be somebody different. Or if they're saying, hey, what you did right there wasn't good, versus they're saying, hey, you're not good. So if we get too defensive, that might lead us to take the position of the fourth horseman of the apocalypse, which is stonewalling. That is like defensiveness on steroids. We pull up some pretty heavy walls, we shut down, we're not coming out from behind those walls, we shut down, we disengage completely. It's also like the silent treatment on steroids. This can be kind of like a last resort if the other horsemen are present, if what you've tried isn't working, if you feel like nothing you could try is going to work. This is just complete and total disengagement. I'm done with this situation. Now, some version of this can be good sometimes. There are times when you do need to take your time out, cool down, reset emotionally, think things through a bit, and then re-engage later, but that's different than stonewalling. The timeout is more of an agreement that you make. You both agree on it, it's productive, it's structured. That's different. Sometimes that is exactly what you need to do. Stonewalling, on the other hand, isn't an agreement. Usually it's when one of you wants to engage and talk or argue and fight, and you're just done. It's a one-way decision. Really hard to get somebody to come out from behind those walls. So if you're stonewalling or you are the stonewaller, probably a good idea to take a look at what is really threatening about engaging. What is it that you're having to go to such extremes to avoid? Sure, it's obvious to say it's the other person you're wanting to avoid, but that's probably not the case. It's probably something deeper. It's probably about some ugly emotion that you're really wanting to avoid feeling, and probably with good reason, or about some deep-seated negative belief about yourself that having that conversation is causing you. Once you know what that is, it puts you in a better position to not feel like you have to retreat behind those high walls and disengage completely. So there are the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And just to be clear, just because that's happening doesn't mean you are getting divorced. Just because you and or your partner use these things sometimes, that does not mean you're about to get divorced. So don't panic. What that means is that this definitely gives you some areas that you can work on, preferably together. Put them out on the table, take a look at them, have some conversations about them, and both commit to some different strategies to do instead of showing contempt or criticism, and instead of getting defensive or stonewalling.